Welcome to the Personal Finance Project. We're going to begin this episode with not only a new name, but a new segment called Things You Pretend to Know or Are Too Afraid to Ask. The goal of these episodes is to break down topics that you feel you should be familiar with, but are not. Today we'll be breaking down tariffs, what they are, why they matter, and most importantly, what it might mean for you. Scott, what is a tariff?
That is a great question. A tariff is basically another word for a tax. And in this particular example, it's a tax levied by a government on goods that are imported. So you're not going to have a tariff moving something from Texas to Ohio, but if you are buying a car that was produced in Italy or Germany and are wanting to bring it over to that same place in Texas, then a tariff would be the tax that the importer pays to bring that good into the country. So this is basically traditionally a very protectionist tax where we're saying to the outside world to a degree, hey, we want our people to buy our stuff and we're going to make it tougher for you to sell your foreign good here. What do you think about that as a definition, Greg?
I think that works as the definition of a tariff. And then I think for this segment, it's aptly named because there are a lot of things in finance that people pretend to know. And I think generally what people pretend to know are not only what you might find in Webster's dictionary listed beneath tariff, but what that might mean for the broader economy. So if we impose a tariff on steel or on sugar, I think a lot of people can understand and readily grasp kind of the first order effect, which is domestic producers of those goods stand to benefit. So you can see people who work at sugar mills, you can see people who work in a steel mill, they're still going to work, and prices of steel in the United States or produced in the United States can compete with, the price of steel that you could otherwise import from a country that could produce it perhaps a little bit lower cost. I think where the conversation gets a little bit more interesting with things like a tariff and many of the other topics we intend on covering here are the second order effects or the unintended consequences of a tariff. And so, some time ago, I could look at the dates for you, but we imposed a tariff on sugar. And so domestic producers of sugar, they benefited because their sugar industry was essentially, I don't know if artificially or synthetically propped up is the right way to put it, but they were more competitive on a global scale. However, the confectionery industry, which are the large users of sugar, they were hit really hard. So the profitability of like confectionery companies, so chocolate makers, things of that kind, they suffered a lot. And we see this happen. So with a steel tariff, you might see the same effect happen on, say, the automotive industry.
Yeah.
Where the users of steel, where they're going to use steel as just a raw material in creation of their end product, they can suffer tremendously because the costs of producing those products go up. And then oftentimes what they'll do is they'll pass those additional costs on to the consumer.
Yeah, I think one thing to think about with tariffs is much like any other tax that gets announced, somebody might like it and somebody probably is going to be very unhappy with that it has been brought about. And the reason for that is exactly like you said. So we're going to put a tariff on steel that's cheaper coming in from China. That's great if you're in Pittsburgh. I'm assuming they've got some Steelers up there. Sorry.
This is good. It was good.
Okay, good. I'm assuming the steel industry there is probably really pleased, but go across the lake to Detroit and they're thinking, oh man, we do not have access to this lower cost steel from China or Japan or wherever it is. Where maybe also another thing you need to think about is that, going back to your kind of Milton Friedman economics, countries kind of get really good at something, over time. So like Switzerland makes a really good watch and some really good chocolates, and Germany makes some really good cars, and Portugal has got cork that they export to the world. And so a lot of times a tariff can make your industry more competitive against these foreign businesses. But if they're just fundamentally better than you in the long run, I don't know if it really helps all that much.
Yeah. And I think for those of us who had the opportunity to take like a macroeconomics 101 class in college, some of the first concepts, which are not easy concepts to grasp, are the principle of what Scott was just getting at there, which is comparative advantage. And then the other one is opportunity costs. So the principle of comparative advantage says if Scott is better than me at something and I'm better than him at something, we should specialize in those things for which we can be most efficient. And even if Scott is as good at both things as I am at just one of those things, it would be better, it might be true, it would be better for Scott to just pick one of those things to specialize in and still allow me to specialize in the other thing, because then we're both as efficiently producing the good that we possibly could, and we can then benefit from trading with one another. The opportunity cost thing, which is totally lost on children, by the way. So it's like, if you watch your kids, if I watch my kids, they don't grasp the concept of, if I am doing one thing, I cannot simultaneously be doing another. And so this is, you can see the ripple effect of this through the economy with something like a tariff, where if steel is now, I would say, artificially more expensive, more dollars are chasing the same, essentially, amount of steel. So steel prices are going up. Those dollars that could have otherwise been saved and invested or used to buy a different good are now wrapped up in your steel purchases.
Yeah.
So if a dollar is spent on good X, it cannot be spent on good or service Y, which is terrible for the other goods and services that are unseen, where those dollars are now wrapped up in steel. And what can be insidious about a tariff is when you have a protectionist tariff, so we say, hey, we really want to protect, domestic producers of XYZ good, that sounds really nice. Like it's a totally admirable position to take, where you're saying, I feel like this is unfair. You were telling me this morning off the recording that there are some goods that China produces and they sell them below cost. And you think, how can we possibly compete with a company that's willing to sell goods below cost? But it doesn't change the fact that if you are now going to force essentially domestic producers into that competitive sphere by artificially raising the price, you still have that lost opportunity. So all of these satellite kind of effects around this one now protected industry are affected, but you can't really see that as well. You can see steel doing fine, but you can't really see the ripple effects that well.
Yeah, and I think the other ripple effect that people are very focused on right now with the current tariffs, especially if they get applied, we've seen them push back on Mexico and Canada. You were telling me off camera earlier that we were, a lot of maybe the rhetoric around those particular tariffs is a negotiating tactic.
Yeah.
It's not really like we desperately want to put tariffs on goods from Canada and Mexico. It's trying to get something out of those countries to advance our political or national interest, which I get. The one thing I will say that kind of goes to that comparative advantage and just the costs that are maybe unseen is kind of a blanket tariff on Canada as an example. We buy, even though we're a net exporter of energy at this point, we still buy energy from Canada. So it's almost kind of cutting off your nose to spite your face a little bit, because we're generally selling oil abroad, but we're still buying some from Canada because it's very close to us, and not every supply chain for energy is perfectly integrated.
Right, and it's very likely that we're buying this particular thing from Canada that Canada is more efficient at producing. So rather than having to produce it domestically, we can buy it from Canada, and there's not a lot of transit costs there, so it's a super efficient trading partner. And then to apply a tariff to that will probably inadvertently harm the United States, and maybe it'll bring Canada to the table on something we want them to do. That's conceivable, but you're right. I do have a little bit of a difficulty seeing kind of the end game there, unless there's this kind of third element hovering around this, where this is what we're talking about, but this isn't really what we're trying to accomplish with tariff.
And I think when we go back to the very first thing that we talked about on why you would implement a tariff, protection, you could argue it's protectionist, because, the Permian could produce more. Yeah. There are fields in the United States that we could bring online. I think there's quite a bit of production in Utah and Colorado and some places where it's a little more expensive, but if the price point was right, we could turn on some production. So bringing on a tariff on Canadian energy, maybe it encourages somebody to go produce some of these shale fields that are a little bit less profitable at, say, $60 a barrel. So one possible reason of doing it.
And I think that's a really good segue into saying there could be an ulterior motive for the tariff, which is we want either things that we want intellectual property and property in the United States, made in the United States, for things like national security or defense. you don't want to be so reliant on trading partners to get you everything that you might need in the event of a war. That seems like a pretty nearsighted strategy. And so you could impose a tariff in order to force innovation on the United States and say, hey, we cannot rely on trading partners for these particular goods and services. It is against the best interest of our national security to do so. So though we could import some of the raw materials for that, we actually want some domestic producers to be competitive, maybe with steel or whatever, for those parts, so that we're not overly reliant on what could become an adversary at some point in time.
Well, and even though COVID has become kind of a hot button political issue and for a lot of people, one thing that was very, very clear was, oh, shoot, regardless of how bad you think COVID is, we can't really make these really good N95 masks, or we're not great at producing like the, maybe some of the vaccine components or something like
or
that.
Whatever, yeah.
Yeah, the PPE, that's a great thing as well. So whether or not you absolutely agree with that particular incident, it was kind of a wake-up call and said, it is tough for us to get some of this stuff when the global trading and supply chain starts to melt down.
Yeah.
And that's, I think, another reason why cars had that crazy cycle where they were so overpriced, because, you have to be able to trade with China to get these rare earths for parts, especially for like the new cars, the Teslas and the Rivians and these electric vehicles.
Not to mention the new big thing now is the chips.
Yeah.
Where all these chips are and these chips are going to be fundamental to pretty much every segment of the economy before we know it. And if we don't have domestic capacity, which some people might say that's redundant, and it's like, I'm all for responsible redundancy. I have 7 children, 2 of whom are twins. So it's like, I love redundancy as long as it is serving a purpose, because economists from time to time will point out, well, probably the best way to do the redundancy thing would be just stockpile the raw materials. It's like, but that costs money. And then it's just sitting there somewhere in a warehouse. Someone's got to pay for that. So there are maybe more efficient ways to accomplish responsible redundancy. But I think that there's definitely a case to be made where when it comes to questions of national security, national defense, or just keeping supply chains active during a pandemic, it might make sense where if a tariff can push us to where we feel comfortable with our domestic production of those goods and services, then maybe it can be temporary. I don't know, protectionist to create an industry full cloth, and then it can drop off as that industry can now compete on its own.
Well, and I think a great example there, and you basically went all the way here, is like Taiwan Semiconductor. They by far make the best of several very, very advanced chips.
Mm-hmm.
So we've got this country that is in limbo, basically. Like we acknowledge them as a country. A bunch of parts of the world think they're part of China.
They're constantly under threat.
They're constantly under threat. So that supply chain is precarious at minimum and dangerous at maximum. So a tariff on microchips to try to get, Intel and some of these guys in the U.S. to get up to speed and be able to produce a chip that's as good as Taiwan Semi, that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah. I mean, I think that kind of thing is extremely responsible. I suppose the next direction we could go with the tariff and why, I mean, we were talking about this earlier. When you have essentially a topic where somebody like Paul Krugman and Milton Friedman or Thomas Sowell and Robert Reich would agree on, and these are gentlemen who view the economy and how it should be run from 2 entirely different ends of the spectrum, they largely all come together when it comes to the benefits of free trade, and they will come together with what prices convey in an economy. So it's saying prices are really what gives information flows in the economy a shape. We can kind of understand something about the market for goods and services by the prices of those goods and services. Mm-hmm. And what a tariff can sometimes do, or a subsidy, is it can distort that flow of information. Because now all of a sudden we've got a synthetically more expensive good in the United States, but it's really not conveying the supply and demand curve very well. It's interrupting it. And generally when you have an interruption in the supply and demand curve, it can lead to essentially a deadweight loss.
Yeah. And I think that is why, if you look at historical examples, and we'll touch on a couple in a little bit, what you tend to find is that people don't set a tariff and then feel like it is, just in the best interests of their country in perpetuity.
No.
They'll have a period where they impose a tariff. There's a reason for it. Maybe they get what they want out of the U.S. producer. They teach the lesson to the international producer that they want to get something out of, and then they drop it. So I think you're right in that most people tend to feel like in the long run, free trade will prevail for kind of protectionist economic policy.
Yeah, and then one of the stickier issues that we kind of talked about off camera was how we feel about what might be considered unethical, say, labor practices around the world.
Yeah.
Where in the United States, we have fairly robust protections against, who can work for how long and in what kind of conditions. And those robust protections don't necessarily exist in other parts of the world, which allows them to produce some goods at a far lower cost than we could really ever conceivably produce them in the United States.
Yeah, like putting a tariff on, silk or just linens from Bangladesh.
Exactly.
It's not going to make us have a linens industry that's going to be able to compete with them.
It's impossible. And it would just get to the point where I think that when we're talking about price distortions, where you have a buyer and a seller who are the primary parties to a transaction, as long as those buyers and sellers are fully informed about the terms of the agreement and how this good is produced. Like there's a big dust up years ago where Nike shoes found out, well, they're paying their, labor and wherever they're being produced. I'm not sure. It was some absurdly low number by the United States standards. But what Nike did is account and said, by where these are being produced, this is a total livable wage. Mm-hmm. So sometimes there can be a misunderstanding on prices because the quality of life or the standard of living in the United States can be so much higher than it is in some of these countries that are exporting the goods that we're buying. But further, I tend to look at prices as our willingness and ability to pay for a good and service as long as we've consented to how it's been created. So Mr. Beast, huge YouTuber, you guys probably know, he has started a chocolate company and his whole goal is, I want to get kids off of the chocolate farms in Africa. And it's like, that's an admirable goal. But my thoughts were, well, if we understand that there are children working on chocolate farms in Africa, the price of that chocolate would have to come down in order to assuage our psyches in terms to get us to buy it. And I don't know, is it the tail wagging the dog here where that's already happened and the prices are reflective of that? Or is he making a case for saying, I don't think people know about this. And if people didn't know about that, then we would see those chocolate prices continue to decline. That's at least how I would understand it.
Yeah, or just, create a situation where buying said product is unacceptable, say, to your national conscience.
Exactly.
That's kind of what happened with South Africa, apartheid. Basically, nobody bought anything from South Africa in the 80s and the early 90s until they did away with that system.
Exactly. So you would hope that when that information was incorporated into economy with free-flowing prices, that the price that we were willing to pay for chocolate that was produced on a farm in Africa by a child would be zero. Saying I'm not buying it. Like I was not going to do it, which would allow domestic or ethically sourced goods and services to essentially now compete because we know all of the information. So I worry when a third-party surrogate, like a government, as an example, imposes a tariff. Because if you think about what's happening there, they're essentially standing between, like you and I, buyer and seller, and they say, hold on, Greg, you can't buy that good from Scott unless you pay a 10% tariff on it because I know better than you what you should be paying for that good or service. And that's where I think the free trade argument really rests, is it's like, no, I think that the producers of these goods or the consumers of these goods, they know the economics of their businesses much better than any third-party surrogate could. And the interests of that third-party surrogate probably don't align exactly with the interests of the party of that transaction. And so that's distorting the price almost needlessly there.
Yeah, I would agree with you. And so adding on to that distortion of the price, I think what a lot of people were Googling and thinking about in the aftermath of the election is, how are tariffs going to impact inflation as we go forward? I think that's probably the most current issue with that in the United States right now. And I think a lot of it is it's going to remain to be seen. There are areas where it's pretty clear that, the producers in the U.S. Or the importers of products in the U.S. are going to pass those prices on. But interestingly, if you look at stock market returns and margins, earning per share over the last couple of years, margins are historically high. So maybe there is an interesting path here where you put a tariff on a good, the consumer pays a little bit more, the corporation makes a little bit less, and the U.S. government raises some money. I don't know. I think there's an interesting argument there. It's probably not perfect, though.
No, and I think that part of this podcast, too, the things you pretend to know, is to draw a distinction between how these things are supposed to work in a purely academic or hypothetical or theoretical exercise on paper, like on an economics 101 exam, and how they tend to work in reality. And I think it was Yogi Berra that said, in theory, there's no difference between theory and practice, but in practice, there's a whole lot of difference. And that's true of virtually anything that you do in an economy, because an economy, a market of any good and service, but particularly the stock market, it's a highly complex, highly adaptive system where things happen and they have, the law of unintended consequences reigns supreme. So to just say flatly that, oh, yeah, all goods are going to rise by exactly the amount of the tariff, I don't think so.
Yeah.
I don't think that's really the consequence of the tariff.
Because there's some goods where if that were the case, people would just choose not to buy them.
Well, yeah.
There are, everybody has like inflection points in their budget where this, you're going to buy ranch dressing for the house, but if it costs $12 a bottle, you might just get mayonnaise instead.
Yeah.
Or something.
Exactly.
Like that.
And so many things in life fall on, I think it was popularized by Laffer, which was, I believe, an economist who worked in Reagan's administration, but the inverted U. We're saying if you know where you're at, you can craft good policy. But a lot of this is just sort of feeling your way through the dark, where it's like if you have, the variable you're changing on one side and you can imagine that the graph is an inverted U, sometimes you get a little bit more toward like something like a tariff, or you raise prices and demand actually goes up. And you think, well, what the heck's going on there? That's counterintuitive. If you made something slightly more expensive, why are people consuming more of it? It's because people change their behavior in response to price changes all the time and not always predictably. Yeah. So I think what you're saying there is we don't know exactly where we're at on that inverted U, and maybe we're not cascading down. Maybe there's still a little bit of room to grow, even if there's a tariff, because people will change their behavior.
It's possible. The other thing that is possible is that, people have been talking for the last 2-3 years about, like, is the consumer in the U.S. getting tapped out? And I think what we keep kind of seeing is, no, not quite. You'll see articles about, like, auto loan delinquencies going up, credit card delinquencies being higher, even with these really high rates. But then generally consumer spending has been pretty good. I think you could say some of that's bifurcation, where the haves are still spending money and the have-nots, or the lower middle class and kind of the working class are struggling. I don't know how long that can sustain, where, you have one big group of people that are just barely getting by, and one that's just kind of absorbing all the inflation and making things look good on the veneer.
It's conceivable. And then I think to wrap, as much as we can, as financial advisors, our thoughts on the economy should manifest in portfolio design.
Yeah.
I think that's, there's a ton of other things that we're doing for our clients, but if we have thoughts on inflation, or we have thoughts on the direction of interest rates, if there's nothing that we're doing in the portfolio, and sometimes no changes are indicated, people might be saying, well, what's in this for me? So I think, and we were talking about this earlier, and you've really been ringing this alarm bell for a long time. Be like, guys, I would not put all the table, I would certainly not hang your hat on the Fed cutting rates a bunch in the near term.
Yeah.
So it seems like it's conceivable that we do get an inflation round two, something that you would warn listeners before of on the podcast, which is why we've kept our portfolios, generally speaking, quite short.
And bond duration.
Yeah, on the bond side.
Yep.
Exactly. Go ahead.
And I think that maybe the takeaway from this conversation is I'd probably stay there.
Yeah.
Because, if you think about how much you made from owning duration, say from 2002 to 2020, it was a nice time for bonds. You got probably about 3% average from yield, and then maybe a 2 to 3% annualized from capital appreciation. If we look at what if something, whether it be tariffs or inflation, takes us up to, say, 10 or 11% interest rates. I'm not predicting it, but if that happens, there's still so much more damage that can be done from the long end. On the short end, it's just not going to hurt you that much. From here, if, say, you've got 4 or 5% short-term bonds versus 4 to 5% intermediate term bonds, yeah, you're going to be searching for yield a little bit quicker. If we're wrong and rates go down really rapidly in the next couple of years, yeah, you're going to need to find some new bonds sooner rather than later. But in the long run, that probably means that the other side of your portfolio, equity or operating businesses in some form or fashion, doing really well.
Yeah. That kind of wraps for the discussion of tariffs and what we think we know about them.
This broadcast contains the current opinions of the hosts and are subject to change. The broadcast is provided for informational purposes only and should not be considered investment advice or recommendations. Investors should obtain professional advice before making investment decisions. This is not a complete analysis of every material fact regarding any company, industry, or security. The information has been obtained from sources we consider to be reliable but cannot guarantee their accuracy. Robert W. Baird & Co. Incorporated is not a legal or tax services provider, and you are strongly encouraged to seek the advice of the appropriate professional advisors before taking any action. For more information about any companies discussed, please contact Baird. Past performance is not indicative of future results, and diversification does not ensure a profit or protect against loss. All investments carry some level of risk, including loss of principal. An investment cannot be made directly in an index. The broadcast may not be reproduced without express permission of Robert W. Baird & Co. Incorporated.